So let's have a look at the first noble truth. So that there's dukkha, suffering. It's not a good translation because according to the theory, all phenomena are subjected to suffering or are a manifestation of dukkha, of suffering. And obviously the pleasurable phenomena are not suffering at the same time. So dukkha means both potential suffering or potential unsatisfactoriness or potential anguish, and then on the other side there is realized, actualized anguish, actualized unsatisfactoriness or actualized suffering. And the difference between the two is that when we relate to phenomena, and that's primarily our own thoughts, our own feelings, the relations we engage in, the things we attach ourselves. So when we relate to the object without understanding impermanence, then we at some time will activate the potential aspect of suffering, and that's evidently dependent upon, of course, what the content of what we are trying to hold on to. We experience anguish when it passes away, and it will for sure. So all phenomena, even these ecstatic jhanic absorptions, are potential suffering. Because even these jhanas, they are impermanent. If you don't maintain, if you don't exercise them regularly, you lose them. So there's the suffering of change, the first kind of dukkha. There are three kinds of dukkha. And the second kind is the suffering or the unsatisfactoriness, both potential and actualized, as both aspects, also in this case, of conditioning. And I think most of you have had some taste of the unsatisfactoriness of mental conditioning. So a thought wanders with your mind against your will. What is happening here? So you want to be mindful, but then all of a sudden you're absent-minded. You want to be energetic, then all of a sudden you're dozing. And it's against your will. You're subjected, your consciousness, your attention, which is that phenomenon most people identify with as their self, is indeed conditioned by things we don't control, right? That's an example of the dukkha of conditioning. And I have mentioned this very square example I'm fond of using. When you get a depression, it's so evidently that you're subjected to suffering because of conditions. And whether you want your depression or not, and who wants a depression? Nobody. It has no effect on the existence of the depression, or on the conditions you're subjected to at that time. Mostly we are not so aware of that the mental states we experience are conditioned when they are connected with pleasure. But as soon as displeasure comes along, we don't want this and we don't want that. I don't want to doze. I want to be energetic right now. We get a taste of the understanding of the suffering of being conditioned. And phenomena are conditioned because they are impermanent. They are aggregates. It's the nature as they are void of this core, of this permanent core. They're void of this essence, which the self is void of. but also all other phenomena. The glass consists of aggregates, chemical aggregates, and when some of the conditions are not present, the phenomenon breaks up. There's no glass inside the glass. You take an onion and you peel off the layers. Do you get into the onion, the internal onion, the permanent onion in there? No, you don't. And the mind is like that. They're just the layers of conditions, of conditioning. And some of that conditioning is not so abstract as I have given examples of here. We all have a story about ourselves, which is the summing up of all the conditions we've been subjected to, and that's why sometimes we change the story a little bit so we avoid the more unpleasant sides of it, dependent, of course, upon to whom we are narrating our life story, our life narrative. And the life narrative pops up in the meditation in form of what we could call the constituents, the raw stuff of the narrative. So 10 years ago I was there and I met this person, and this person said this to me, and I said that to this person, so on. Things, small fragments of the life story comes along in that way and becomes the basis of the story we are capable of telling about our life. It's not always we have the opportunity to tell the whole story, but we could write it down, and some people do. Usually we tell part of it to somebody who are close to us, but a different version every time we're telling it, because it is changing, and we, the narrator, the one who narrates the story, is also changing continually. So the story is slightly different every time. And as I said, most people identify with attention, with consciousness as their self. And another phenomenon that we identify very much with is, of course, the story of our lives, our life narrative. I have this long story. I'm from Denmark, and I'm so old, and I went to India, and I met this person, and now I'm teaching meditation, and so on. Story. Could be a long story. But it's like the river, it's flowing, and there's no part of that story that exercises sovereignty over my mind. And that's what we should want of this self, that the self must be independent. It must be, in order to be itself, in order to be as self, it must be autonomous. It must exercise sovereignty over itself. And when the self is a dependent phenomenon, subjected to a lot of conditions, it is not that kind of a self. It's not an autonomous self. And of course, trying to construct this self out of various conditions, that is a primary example of potential conditioning dukkha. Because this identity will fall apart, this construction will fall apart at one time or another. And of course, literature and dramas are full of plots that display this tragedy, people's identities falling apart and people deluding each other with pretending to be something which they are not, and so on and so forth. Identities are something we construct by way of this dynamic holding on to what is pleasant and condemning what is unpleasant. It's always, according to Buddhist psychology, an unwholesome state of mind in which this is going on. There's ignorance of three root conditions. Ignorance, not knowing. It doesn't mean ignorance of a specific theory, but means ignorance as a reduced level of attention. So you don't see reality in your focus. You don't see impermanency. You don't see potential suffering. You don't see no causa. And when there's ignorance, Buddha goes to this commentator. He says it's like when a huge black cloud passes over the moon, and in this darkness there's desire, thirst, the second unwholesome root condition, and it's always a thirst for identities, for ego reference, for self. Buddha likens the desire thirst to a thief standing behind the door, and then when there is a pleasurable object, clinging to is like the hand of the thief. Oops, that's for me. And the negative version of that is activated by the second unwholesome root condition: ill will, anger, any kind of aversion, condemnation, go away attitude. This is not I, this is not me, this is me, but not this. All the happy times I had when I got involved with these various incidents, that actually is the cause of my depression now. All those happy hours, that was me, but the depression, that's not me. Very illusory. And then there's a third kind of dukkha. Dukkha, as I said yesterday, means bad hollowness. Etymological, bad hollowness, and refers to this lack of core in things, this lack of permanence in phenomena, and especially in the self. We all know our body is impermanent and it dies. It's not so hard to understand. It's more difficult to understand that in the psyche there is nothing permanent there. And because we have some sort of basic intuition of that it may be so, we have this great longing for permanency. But paradoxically, we try continually to project this longing for permanency into things that are impermanent. Try to hold on to a thought, to a feeling, to a relationship, to some circumstances, whatever. Try to hold on to our life. So because of this, there's this third kind of dukkha, which is the easiest kind of dukkha to understand. Even a child understands that kind of dukkha. It's called dukkha dukkhata. It means suffering of suffering. That is despairing and difficult to bear, anxiety, depressions, envy, greed, frustration, hopelessness, feeling helpless, and so on and so forth. All these negative emotions that in essence are created by the two other dukkhas, the impermanence, oh, I've lost everything. And the conditions, being subjected to conditions, I'm united with something I don't want to be united to. It's a despairing situation. I don't want this, but I cannot get what I want. So frustration arises. But the First Noble Truth has to be seen in relation to the Second Noble Truth, because it is actually not impermanence nor conditioning. that is the cause of suffering, knows this thirst after permanency. This second noble truth is the noble truth about the desire thirst for permanence in the impermanent, for a source of joy in what turns out to be a source of suffering, because this is impermanent. And desire thirst for core self or core identity in what turns out to be a hallucination. And when we become disillusioned with that hallucination and give up maintaining it, we see that there's no core self. There's no core self. There's a stream of consciousness, the vijnana sota, just like a river flowing on. And whenever the desire thirst is struggling with this river, trying to hold on, tries to hold on and push away, based on a lot of hallucinations. There are three kinds of hallucinations: vipallasa, the hallucination of perception, and the hallucination of mental states, and the hallucination of intellectual views. When you hallucinate the permanent and what is impermanent, you begin to that influences the way you develop your life story. So the life story is often structured by this illusion of a core self. And that is the hallucination or the illusion of views that depend on perception and mental states. When you perceive mental states as containing a core and so on, you are hallucinating something that is not there, and you may begin to develop a story about it. Oh, I am like that. And the life history, the life narrative that pops up as fragments in the meditation are memories, as I just gave example of before, but often completely structured by this illusion of core self. And of course, when you have this illusion, you suffer terribly when you get a depression. You suffer terribly when you think that you are your life history, that you are everything that has happened to you, including this depression. Your feeling of helplessness is manifold more than if you can just be with the depression and see it as some thoughts and some feelings, and understand that the depression is due to some conditions in your past where ignorance and desire thirst were at play. And that's a way to deconstruct, with a modern word, deconstruct your self-narrative based on a core, on the idea of a core, based on the idea of an autonomous core. I'm stressed and I don't understand because I'm autonomous, and then I start blaming myself because I'm stressed. So I should have done something else. But maybe you could not have done anything because there is not this core. You were subjected to conditions. And when you begin to see into the conditioning of yourself, you begin to see your problems as common conditions of life that other beings also are subjected to. They're not your private problem. They are part of an existential problem. But we begin to liberate ourselves from this idea, this illusion of core self, in the context of the life narrative as it passes by. And as I said, it's not like an elegant story that just comes along. No, it's all these fragments, all this the raw stuff of it. So 10 years ago, I had this quarrel, and my childhood was not too good, and my father was like that, but I had a nice mother, and so on and so forth. All this, the raw stuff of the narrative comes along. And then, when you are very mindful, you see that memories consist of two layers. There is what actually happened to you, and that's what pops up initially. So my dog died when I was 10 years old. That happened. It's a fact. But the other half of it is the interpretation of it. And whereas the fact, the historical fact, is fixed, the interpretation is not. So as you sit there in the meditation and you see, so my dog died when I was 10 years old, you have the opportunity to reinterpret that incident. Instead of repeating an interpretation you began when you were 10 years old and you maybe have repeated ever since. I lost the best thing I owned, and that kind of thing always happens to me. I'm always subject to the worst scenario, and I'm helpless. The foundation of some sort of depression. And an interesting thing is that when we don't meditate, we usually just go on senselessly repeating interpretations from long time ago of events long time ago, as if we were still living in the past. But we have the freedom to reinterpret, and that's the kind of thing you can do when you go in psychotherapy, but it's much cheaper and much more effective to do it in meditation. Because everything comes by. And there's not another person, there's psychotherapists to interfere, there's no filter. His or her understanding might be a help, but might not also not be a help. So in meditation you see directly into the conditioning of your mind, the conditioning of your self-narrative. And it doesn't mean that the story you have about yourself vanishes. Even the Buddha had a story about himself. He narrates it time and again in the discourses. I think I haven't counted the numbers when he talks about himself. His childhood, his youth, when he was searching for a path to enlightenment, up till the time when he achieved enlightenment. The end of his life story is actually an exposition of the Four Noble Truths. That's the story he ended up having about himself. A life narrative that reflects his wisdom. But still he's a person, of course. It's his narrative, it's not somebody else's. So this story is identical with itself. Right? It's his story, it's Buddha's story. Like each one of you have a story about yourself that is identical with itself. And that is your process identity, the modern word. That's your process identity. But an important point is you cannot identify in the perspective of a substance identity with your process identity. You cannot. It's impossible. That's what this desire thirst does all the time. That's for me this thought, this feeling, this memory, You cannot. It flows by, passes by. There's nothing there to hold on to. But still you have this processor identity. You've lived this life you've lived, and you have a story about it. Most people's stories about themselves is not so authentic. But when you begin to meditate, you cultivate a very authentic version based on a very realistic understanding of what actually went on. So anatta, this summing up characteristicon of all phenomena according to the Buddhist teaching, doesn't mean it's translated as no self, and it refers to the negation of the Atman, the theory of Atman you find in the Upanishad. There's no need to go into details with this, but this concept is conditioned by this very dominating idea at the time of the Buddha. So anatta does not mean that there's no self. There's this, but it's not a permanent self. It's not an autonomous self. It's this process self. It's this impermanent self subjected to conditioning that develops. And it's part of the human condition to develop a story about yourself that develops a story about everything that has happened. And most of the time it's not a realistic story. It's based on a lot of hallucinations and illusions, but you can you can free yourself of all those hallucinations and illusions. So you end up with a wisdom story like the one the Buddha had about himself. He did not identify with his story. And he tells it, I think I haven't counted the numbers, he tells this maybe 25, 30 times in the canon. Always as part of his teaching, how he grew up in very happy circumstances, except for one fact, that already as a boy he was very aware of that people grew old, fell sick and died. And later he said many times, if there were not such a thing as old age, disease and death, there would be no need for enlightenment. And sometimes he also uses this concept in a symbolic sense as a description of one object that arises, changes and dies. One thought, one Dharma. One Dharma is one thought, or one feeling, one sound, one taste, one phenomenon. It arises, it changes and it dies. That is sometimes he uses the word birth, old age and death. And sometimes old age, disease and death applied to just one moment. And if life were not impermanent and so fleeting as this one moment is already gone, there would be no need to liberate ourselves from the stream of phenomena, the stream of consciousness, from our existential situation. So desire thirst is the second noble truth, cause of suffering. And the third noble truth is the elimination of desire thirst. And that is actually what we are practicing. Maybe you don't appreciate the framing of those concepts, that you're working on getting rid of your desire for self. Maybe you're, on the contrary, you're inspired to meditate out of desire of finding out about yourself. Such a popular phrase in Western culture, to find oneself. I go on this retreat in order to find myself. I go into psychotherapy in order to find myself. And a lot of psychotherapies, they have also these ideas. You will find yourself. you will know about the core of yourself, your true core. But when you peel all the layers of the onion, what is the true core there? Well, some sort of liberation, but not if you approach it in the right way, as we do in meditation. The elimination of the desire thirst, the Buddha describes a lot of times with one epistemological sequence. And it goes like this. When you see the impermanence in something you thought were permanent, when you see a source to suffering in something you thought were a source of joy, when you see no cause self in something you thought were cause self, then you become disenchanted or disillusioned with what you're seeing. You become disillusioned or disenchanted. It's two transcriptions of the same Pali word nibbida. Nibbida. It's a psychological term that derives directly from Vipassana. So what is the mind doing when it becomes disenchanted with the thought or with the feeling? Because it sees the momentariness of it. Maybe of something that you previously identified with. So what does the mind do then? How do you experience disillusioning or disenchantment? Well, there is an analog to it, to the way most people behave when they are out when they are in a tropical country, and when there are lots of snakes, and they walk down a path in the forest, and they see a branch lying there on the path. On the outside, they perceive it as a branch, and then looking closer, they see it's a snake. So that discovery corresponds in some way to seeing the impermanence in something you thought were permanent, seeing no cause self in something you thought were cause self. So then when you see the branch is a snake, you just don't turn around and walk away. No, you stop. And then you increase your attention on the snake. You increase your attention on what you are becoming disillusioned with, what you're becoming disenchanted with. It's like you're surprised. Oh, wow! Is that what it's all about? There's an element of amazement. And then you walk slowly backwards, removing yourself from the snake, while you are in this highly attentive state of mind. Have any one of you had this experience in tropical climate with snakes? I mean, it's so common. And it applies to what the inside mind does when you become disillusioned. Nibbida, the Buddha says, you become disillusioned. And then you let go, viraga, of your habitual reaction. You don't go out and try to sort out in your experience. You don't go out and try to lay hold or push away. You let go of your reaction. And then vimutti, you are liberated. For that moment, for that perceptual process. So this is liberation on the momentary level, which goes on all the time in Vipassana meditation. Maybe you're not in the state all the time, but in between, as you begin to do Vipassana, and it is a learning process. Maybe some of you haven't started doing Vipassana yet. Some of you have just started because you've been on previous retreats. You begin to have these insights, and they disenchant you, they disillusion you, and you experience the change of reaction when you have these insights, and you experience a moment of freedom, and this karma connected with this insight is a special karma. It's neither black nor white, the Buddha says, but it's that karma which eliminates all karma. It's that karma that liberates the mind, that deconditions the mind. And it accumulates. It accumulates. And the accumulation of such karma is what finally leads to enlightenment. I won't reflect on this difficult term. This is not the place to do it. On a 2-day retreat. But the culmination of the Third Noble Truth is the final disillusionment with consciousness, with existence and time, and the letting go of whatever reaction you have ever had. And then there's a liberation. There is a letting go of consciousness itself. And there's a transcendence of consciousness. That's enlightenment. That's the accumulation. There's a relative aspect of the Third Noble Truth, and there's the absolute respect. And then there's the Four Noble Truths of the medicine, of the way to the elimination of the Third Noble Truth. That's the Noble Eightfold Path we're practicing. Right view, a synonym of intuitive understanding, right intention, intention of loving kindness that leads to moral behavior, the intention of loving kindness in speech, in action, and livelihood, and the intention of practicing insight meditation. The formal wording of that intention is the intention of renunciation, but it is on a psychological level. What you renounce is ignorance, desire, thirst, and ill will. And the way to renounce it is in meditation. So the one intention leads to the moral section, right speech, right action, right livelihood. The accumulation of such karma supports the development of the third section, right effort in connection with the meditative practice, and right mindfulness, sammasati, which are these four foundations of mindfulness we've been practicing, and right concentration, which we have also been practicing the beginning levels of. Right concentration it defines formally all 8 jhanas, but the very first development of any concentration up to the level of the 8th jhana. And you can understand this Four Noble Truth in a linear way. So you start out thinking, you start out with some view, okay, so maybe a good thing to start meditating. And then you give rise to the intention, so I'll go to this retreat and learn meditating. And because you have a previous accumulation of acts of right speech, right action, right livelihood, it's easy for you to start meditating and be inspired by the truth of this kind of existential practice. So then you stir up energy, right effort, and you develop mindfulness and concentration. But all these 8 links, they also co-arise in one moment of consciousness, but on an intuitive level. Then there's intuitive seeing, and there's intention. In that state of mind, always intention in a karmic consciousness. And the intention here is to develop the path and to see into the nature of things. And there is right effort, there's mindfulness, there's the concentration, and there's a moral section as a support condition below the whole thing on the pre-conscious level. In Zen Buddhism, And I don't know much about Zen Buddhism, except I've read certain things, and it's a common phrase that when the Zen master gives some difficult teaching, people say, "Oh, you want us," his disciples say, "Oh, you want us to swallow a glowing iron ball." Yes, I want you to swallow this glowing iron ball. And then you're somehow stuck if you don't find a solution to that predicament. So maybe I have wanted you to swallow a glowing iron ball. And there's not much you can do about it except meditating. You don't have to. This is the Buddhist theory. I have also relied on some Western psychology. So of course it is my understanding of the Four Noble Truths, but in the formal words of the discourses of the Buddha. And you don't have to accept this theory because it's not something you should understand intellectually. If you are inspired by what I've said, that is fine. But you should develop your own understanding. What I've been talking about is like a map of the country. It's not enough to have a map of the country. You have to go on a journey yourself.